You're nothing but a servant's bastard, and everyone knows it." The words hit like ice water thrown across her face. Lyra felt them settle into the familiar hollow space in her chest, where all the cruelties had carved out their home over the years. She kept her head down, her hands steady as she mucked out the stall, even though her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin. The mare beside her nickered softly, the only kindness she would receive today. "Did you hear me, girl?" Margot's voice carried that particular edge that meant she was feeling especially vicious. The head stable master enjoyed her authority over the few servants ranked below her, and Lyra had always been her favourite target. "I said you're nothing." Lyra had heard her. She had been hearing variations of the same thing for 23 years. That had always been enough. She was nothing, nobody, the girl who cleaned stalls and hauled water and disappeared into shadows when the important people walked by. She had learned to be invisible because invisible meant safe, and safe meant surviving another day in a world that had no place for someone like her. But today felt different. Today, something ancient and restless paced behind her ribs, something that whispered she was tired of being nothing. "Lyra!" The voice that cut through the stable belonged to Marcus, the head steward of the great house. His appearance sent a ripple of surprise through the other servants, because Marcus never came to the stables. His pristine uniform and polished boots looked absurdly out of place among the hay and horse sweat. "There you are. You're to come with me immediately." Margot's mouth fell open. "Sir, there must be some mistake. Lyra is just a stable hand. She's not. She's been specifically requested." Marcus's tone brooked no argument. His pale eyes found Lyra where she stood frozen beside the stall, pitchfork still in her hands. "The Alpha King requires additional servants for his war council meetings. You've been selected." The pitchfork clattered to the ground. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the stable turned toward her. Selected for the war council. Selected to serve the Alpha King himself. It was impossible. It was terrifying. It was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her entire life avoiding. "But why her?" Margot sputtered, her face flushing red with indignation. "She's completely unsuitable. She doesn't know the first thing about proper service. She can't even—" "The selection has been made." Marcus's voice carried the finality of a closing door. "Lyra, you have 10 minutes to make yourself presentable. You'll be serving wine during today's strategic planning session." Strategic planning session, wine service, the Alpha King's War Council. Each phrase hit her like a physical blow, because each one meant exposure, meant being seen, meant standing in a room full of the most powerful people in the kingdom while carrying a secret that could get her killed. The secret currently pressed against her thigh beneath her rough servant's dress, wrapped in oiled leather and bound with strips of cloth torn from her one decent shift. The moonblade of House Silvermoon, the last relic of the fallen dynasty, the proof of a bloodline everyone believed extinct. She had carried it for 3 years, ever since her grandmother pressed it into her hands with shaking fingers and whispered the words that changed everything. "You are the last little moon. The blade chooses its bearer, and it has chosen you. Trust no one. Hide what you are until the time comes to reclaim what was stolen." Lyra had spent every day since then making sure that time would never come. She had perfected the art of being nobody, of sliding through life without leaving so much as a shadow. She worked in the stables because no one important ever looked at stable hands. She lived in the servants' quarters because no one questioned a servant's right to exist as long as she stayed in her place. But now Marcus stood waiting, and refusing his summons meant questions she couldn't answer. Worse, it meant the kind of attention that led to searches, and searches led to discovery, and discovery led to the executioner's block. "I'll be ready," she heard herself say, though her voice sounded thin and distant. "Good. Report to the kitchens first for proper attire. You'll be briefed on protocol." Marcus turned on his heel and strode away, leaving behind the scent of expensive soap and the echo of polished boots on stone. The stable erupted in whispers the moment he disappeared. Lyra stood frozen in the centre of it all, acutely aware of every stare, every speculation, every cruel smile that promised this unexpected elevation would make her fall all the more spectacular. "Well, well," Margot said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Looks like our little nobody is about to learn what happens when servants get above themselves." Lyra said nothing. She couldn't speak past the terror clawing up her throat, couldn't think beyond the impossible task ahead of her. She had to walk into a room full of alphas, had to stand in the presence of the most powerful man in the kingdom, had to serve wine with steady hands while the blade that marked her as a traitor pressed against her skin like a burning coal. She had to do all of this without anyone discovering that the servant they dismissed as nothing was actually the rightful heir to a crown that no longer existed. 10 minutes. She had 10 minutes to prepare for the performance of her life, 10 minutes to become someone who could stand in the Alpha King's presence without falling apart, 10 minutes to make sure the secret she carried stayed buried beneath layers of practiced invisibility. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, being treated as less than. But what if they had all been wrong? What if she was something far more dangerous than nothing? What if she was everything they feared most? The blade grew warm against her thigh, as if it could sense her thoughts, as if it approved of this first crack in the armour of her carefully constructed invisibility. For just a moment, standing in the scattered hay with the eyes of every servant upon her, Lyra felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She felt like she might be worth something after all. But that way lay madness and death, so she crushed the feeling down into the dark place where she kept all her impossible dreams. She was nothing. She had always been nothing, and she would remain nothing, no matter who summoned her or where she had to go. Even if that nothing had to serve wine to the Alpha King himself, even if that nothing carried the blade that could reshape the world. The battle unfolded exactly as Lyra had predicted, with a precision that made even the most sceptical generals stare at her with something approaching awe. The enemy's first wave hit the eastern wall like a thunderclap, their war cries echoing across the courtyard as they threw ladders against the ancient stones and began their assault with the confidence of an army that had never known defeat. But the defenders were ready. Hidden in the shadows of the inner buildings, crouched behind carefully positioned barriers, they waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was walking directly into the trap. Lyra stood on the battlements beside the Alpha King, the moonblade finally free from its concealment and singing in her grip like a tuning fork struck by divine hands. The weapon had transformed the moment she drew it, evolving from the simple sword she had carried in secret to something that belonged in legends. Its star-forged silver blade caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly, while ancient runes carved into the metal pulsed with power that made the air itself shimmer with possibility. "Now I understand why they called your ancestors the Moonstone Queens," Demon said, his voice filled with wonder as he watched the weapon's ethereal glow. "You look like you were carved from starlight itself." She did feel different, transformed. The moment she had drawn the blade, something fundamental had shifted in the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she existed in the world. Generations of warrior queens flowed through her veins, their knowledge and skill and supernatural grace merging with her own, until she could no longer tell where Lyra the servant ended and the Moonstone Queen began. "There," she said, pointing to the breach that had just opened in the eastern wall. "They're through." Enemy soldiers poured into the courtyard like water through a broken dam, their triumph evident in every movement as they raised their weapons and shouted victory cries. They thought they had won, thought they had broken the kingdom's defences and claimed their prize. They had no idea they were standing in a carefully constructed killing field. "Signal the archers," Lyra commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been born to lead armies. "Wait until they're all inside the courtyard, then close the trap." The Alpha King raised his hand, and across the castle, answering signals flashed from hidden positions. Archers appeared in upper windows, their bows drawn and arrows nocked. Cavalry thundered into position at the north gate, while infantry emerged from the south corridor, their steel gleaming like deadly promises in the morning light. The enemy realized their mistake just as the trap snapped shut around them. Their victory cries turned to screams of rage and terror as they found themselves surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run, and enemies closing in from every direction. "Now," Lyra said, and her voice carried across the battlefield like the song of ancient queens who had stood on these same walls and defended this same kingdom. "Show them what happens when they threaten what is ours." What followed was not a battle so much as a symphony of destruction, orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood warfare not just as strategy, but as art. The trap closed with mechanical efficiency, enemy forces crushed between converging walls of steel and flame and supernatural wrath. But it was Lyra herself who became the stuff of legends that day. She moved through the battle like a force of nature, the moonblade singing as it cut through enemy steel as if it were paper. Every strike was perfect, every movement fluid as water and deadly as lightning. She fought with the skill of someone who had been trained from birth for moments like this, but also with something more, the accumulated experience of every queen who had ever wielded the blade before her. An enemy commander charged her with a war cry that should have frozen her blood, his massive axe aimed at her head with killing force, but she moved like moonlight given form, sliding aside at the last possible moment and bringing the moonblade up in an arc that separated his head from his shoulders before he even realized she had moved. "Impossible!" another soldier gasped, backing away from her with terror written across his scarred face. "She's not human." "No," she agreed, advancing on him with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known doubt. "I'm something far more dangerous. I'm a queen reclaiming her birthright." The battle turned into a rout as word spread through the enemy ranks that they faced not just superior tactics, but supernatural power itself. Men who had fought dragons without flinching broke and ran at the sight of Lyra, moving through their ranks like an avatar of divine retribution, the moonblade leaving trails of silver light in the air with every killing stroke. Demon fought beside her, his own supernatural strength and speed making him a terror on the battlefield, but even he seemed awed by the transformation he witnessed in his mate. Through the bond that connected them, she could feel his wonder and pride and something deeper, the recognition that he was witnessing the emergence of something that had been prophesied for generations. When the last enemy soldier fell or fled, when the courtyard was silent except for the groans of the wounded and the distant sound of retreating hoofbeats, Lyra stood in the centre of it all like a figure from ancient legend. The moonblade in her grip no longer glowed with supernatural fire, but somehow that only made her more impressive. She had proven herself through steel and blood and tactical brilliance, had shown the entire kingdom that she was exactly what the prophecy had promised. "My lords and ladies," Demon's voice carried across the battlefield with the authority of absolute conviction, "may I present Queen Lyra of House Silvermoon, rightful heir to the Moonstone throne, my chosen mate, and the tactical genius who just saved all our lives." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of recognition and dawning understanding. These were men who had spent their lives serving the crown, who understood the difference between political marriage and the kind of supernatural bond that could reshape kingdoms. They had witnessed power that defied explanation, leadership that transcended normal human capability, and a love that burned bright enough to rewrite the rules of succession itself. One by one, they knelt, not because protocol demanded it, not because they feared retribution, but because they recognized truth when they saw it blazing like starfire in a queen's eyes. General Morrison was the first to speak, his gruff voice filled with something that might have been reverence. "Your Majesty, the kingdom is yours to command." "No," Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent battlefield. "The kingdom belongs to all of us. I am simply here to help protect it." But even as she spoke the words, even as she tried to maintain some vestige of the humility that had protected her for so long, she knew that everything had changed. She could see it in the way the soldiers looked at her, in the way Demon's eyes burned with pride and possession, in the way the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility around her. She was no longer the servant girl who cleaned stalls and hauled water. She was no longer the hidden heir who lived in terror of discovery. She was Queen Lyra of House Silvermoon, and she had claimed her birthright through fire and blood and the strength of her own hand. The only question now was whether the rest of the kingdom would be wise enough to accept what the battlefield had already proven beyond doubt. As if summoned by that very thought, a commotion arose at the main gates. Lady Vivian appeared, her golden hair dishevelled and her blue silk gown stained with dust from hard riding. Behind her came a contingent of armed men wearing her family's colours, their faces grim with the knowledge that they had arrived too late to influence the battle's outcome. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Vivian's voice cracked like a whip across the sudden silence. "I demand an explanation for this charade." Demon stepped forward, his presence radiating the kind of controlled power that made grown men step backward without conscious thought. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and the promise of violence for anyone foolish enough to challenge what he had claimed. "There is no charade, Lady Vivian, only truth finally revealed. The engagement between us is hereby dissolved. I have found my true mate, my equal in all things, and she will be my queen." "Your mate?" Lady Vivian's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "This servant girl, this nobody who claims royal blood she cannot prove." "Can't I?" Lyra stepped forward, the moonblade still gleaming in her grip, her presence suddenly filling the courtyard with the kind of authority that made kingdoms kneel. "Would you like to test that claim, Lady Vivian? Would you like to challenge my right to stand beside the Alpha King as his equal?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had just proven herself capable of rewriting the rules of warfare itself. Lady Vivian's face went white as she suddenly realised that the servant girl she had tried to destroy was something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She started, then stopped as her survival instincts finally overcame her wounded pride. "The challenge stands open to anyone who questions my claim," Lyra continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "Single combat by blade and honour, winner takes all." The offer hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone present understood the implications. This was not just about marriage or politics, or even succession. This was about the fundamental right to rule, about whether strength and supernatural gift trumped bloodline and political alliance. Lady Vivian looked around the courtyard, taking in the kneeling soldiers, the blood-soaked stones, the evidence of a victory that defied all reasonable explanation. When her eyes finally returned to Lyra, they held the bitter recognition of someone who had finally understood exactly how badly she had miscalculated. "I withdraw any claim to the Alpha King's hand," she said, the words coming out stilted and formal. "May your reign be prosperous." It was surrender disguised as courtesy, defeat wrapped in diplomatic language. But it was surrender nonetheless, delivered before witnesses who would carry the story to every corner of the kingdom. Lyra smiled, and for the first time since this whole impossible journey began, it was the smile of someone who had finally stopped running from what she was meant to become. "Thank you, Lady Vivian. Your gracious acceptance of my claim will be remembered." As Lady Vivian withdrew with what remained of her dignity, As the soldiers began the grim work of clearing the battlefield, as the sun climbed higher in a sky that seemed somehow brighter than it had before, Lyra found herself standing beside the man who had claimed her as his mate and chosen her as his queen. "So," Demon said, his voice warm with satisfaction and something deeper, "how does it feel to finally stop pretending to be nobody?" She looked out over the battlefield where she had proven herself, over the kingdom that was now truly hers to protect, over the future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. Like coming home, she said, and for the first time in her life she meant it completely. The darkness came 3 days after the victory, seeping from the forbidden territories like spilled ink across parchment, carrying with it the scent of ancient malice and forgotten nightmares. The shadow creatures that emerged from the twisted landscape beyond the kingdom's borders were nothing like the human enemies they had defeated so decisively in the castle's courtyard. These things had never been human at all. Lyra stood on the battlements watching the unnatural darkness spread across the horizon, the moonblade at her side humming with a resonance that made her teeth ache. The weapon had not returned to its dormant state since the battle. Instead, it continued to pulse with silver light that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, as if it were preparing for something far more dangerous than mere mortal warfare. "The scouts report that entire villages have gone silent," Demon said, joining her at the wall. His presence settled around her like familiar warmth, but even through the mate bond she could feel his unease at the supernatural threat gathering beyond their borders. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just emptiness. "They're not killing people," Lyra said, her voice distant as ancestral memories stirred in the depths of her mind. "They're consuming them, taking their essence, their life force, their very existence, and adding it to their own power." "How could you possibly know that?" She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of queens who had faced this same darkness generations ago. "Because this has happened before, 25 years ago, just before the fall of the Moonstone dynasty. The shadow creatures awakened from their slumber in the deep places of the world, drawn by some disturbance in the magical balance." "What kind of disturbance?" The blade at her side pulsed once, as if answering his question, and suddenly she understood with the kind of terrible clarity that made her stomach clench with dread. "Me, my awakening, the return of Moonstone power to the world has disturbed something that was meant to stay sleeping." Diamond's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own as the mate bond flared between them like golden fire. "Then we face them together. Whatever they are, whatever they want, we stand against them, as we stood against human enemies." "These aren't human enemies." Her voice carried the weight of ancestral terror, memories of queens who had fought this same battle and lost everything in the process. "These are the things that existed before kingdoms, before civilization, before the light came to push back the primordial darkness. They are hunger given form, entropy made manifest, and they will not stop until everything that lives has been devoured." As if summoned by her words, the darkness at the horizon suddenly surged forward, racing across the landscape with unnatural speed. Where it passed, the very land seemed to wither and die, grass turning to ash and trees collapsing into dust as if centuries of decay had occurred in moments. And riding at the head of that tide of destruction came something that made even the moonblade's light seem dim by comparison. A figure wreathed in shadow and crowned with darkness, tall as a cathedral spire and radiating malevolence that pressed against her mind like physical weight. The Shadow King. The same entity that had destroyed the original Moonstone Kingdom, that had consumed Queen Seraphina and her court in a single night of apocalyptic darkness. He had returned, drawn by the resurgence of the power that had banished him so long ago. "We can't fight this from the walls," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "The shadows will consume the castle stone by stone, and everyone inside with it. We have to meet them in the open, where our light can shine unobstructed. Our light? She turned to face him fully, and he saw that her eyes had begun to glow with the same silver radiance that pulsed from the moonblade. The prophecy spoke of two souls, one crown, united by moon and storm. Your wolf carries the fire of the ancient king's demon, lightning and thunder, and the primal force that shaped the world from chaos. Together, our power might be enough to send the darkness back to whatever hell spawned it. They descended into the castle's depths, into chambers carved from living rock that predated human memory. Here, in the sacred grove that had been transplanted from the original Moonstone Kingdom, ancient magic still pulsed in the very stones. Silver trees with leaves like captured starlight grew in impossible soil, their roots drinking from springs that ran deeper than the world's foundation. It was here that Queen Seraphina had made her final stand against the Shadow King. Here that she had died trying to seal away the darkness that threatened to consume everything she loved. The grove remembered, and as Lyra stepped into its ethereal light, she could feel the weight of that ancient sacrifice pressing against her consciousness. "This is where it began," she said, her hand trailing along the silver bark of the nearest tree. "And this is where it ends, one way or another." The darkness arrived like a tsunami of malevolence, crashing against the grove's barriers with force that made the ancient trees sway and bend. Shadow creatures poured through the gaps between worlds, things with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars, their forms shifting and writhing as if they couldn't decide what shape terror should take. But it was the Shadow King himself who commanded attention, his presence a void in reality that hurt to look at directly. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of civilizations dying, of hope being strangled in its cradle. So, the little moon returns to die where her grandmother failed. His laughter was the echo of every scream that had ever been silenced. How fitting, how deliciously symmetrical. "I'm not my grandmother," Lyra said, stepping forward with the moonblade blazing like a star in her grip. "And I didn't come here to repeat her mistakes." "No?" The Shadow King's form rippled with amusement. "Then what did you come here to do, little queen? What makes you think you can succeed where she failed?" "Because she fought alone." Lyra's voice rang through the grove with absolute conviction. "And I don't." Demon stepped up beside her, and the air around them began to crackle with electricity. His wolf pressed forward against his human skin, not seeking to take control but to merge, to become something greater than either man or beast alone. Lightning danced between his fingers as storm clouds gathered overhead, called by power that had slept in his bloodline since the first Alpha King claimed his throne. "Two souls, one crown," Lyra whispered, reaching for his hand with her free one. "United by moon and storm until the kingdom knows peace eternal." The moment their skin touched, power exploded through the grove like the birth of a new sun. Silver light and golden lightning merged into something that transcended both, a radiance so pure and fierce that the shadow creatures shrieked and recoiled as if they had been burned. The very air sang with harmonic frequencies that made reality itself ring like a struck bell. The Shadow King's amusement vanished, replaced by something that might have been alarm. Impossible. The ancient bonds were severed when the Moonstone line fell. They cannot be restored. Can't they? Lyra's voice carried the authority of every queen who had ever stood in this place, every woman who had wielded the moonblade in defence of light against darkness. You killed my grandmother, consumed her essence, broke the bond that held your prison sealed. But bonds forged in love and tempered by choice are not so easily destroyed. The combined power of moon and storm flowed through them both, Lyra's silver radiance amplifying Demon's lightning until it became something that could remake the world or destroy it with equal ease. She could feel his strength through the mate bond, could sense his absolute trust in her to guide their merged power toward victory rather than mutual annihilation. The battle that followed was not fought with swords or strategy, but with pure will, light against darkness, creation against entropy, love against the hungry void that wanted to devour everything that had ever dared to exist. The grove became the focal point of forces that had shaped reality since the dawn of time, silver trees bending under pressure that could crush mountains. But gradually, impossibly, the light began to win. The Shadow King's form wavered as their combined radiance ate away at his substance like acid, his certainty cracking as he realized that what had been destroyed could indeed be restored, that love could forge bonds stronger than death itself. "This is not possible," he snarled, his voice losing some of its cosmic authority as doubt crept into his ancient consciousness. "I consumed the Moonstone Line. I broke the bonds that held me prisoner. I am inevitable." "You are obsolete." Lyra's blade rose until its point was directed at the heart of darkness itself. "The world has moved beyond you, grown past your primitive hunger. We are not our ancestors, bound by their fears and limitations. We are something new, something you were never prepared to face." The final strike was not physical, but metaphysical, a joining of moon and storm that created something beyond either element alone. Light poured from their combined will like water from a broken dam, washing over the Shadow King and his minions with purifying force that unmade them at the molecular level. The darkness screamed as it died, a sound that echoed across dimensions and made reality itself shudder in relief. When the light finally faded, when the impossible forces they had summoned settled back into the natural order of things, the grove was silent except for the whisper of silver leaves in an impossible breeze. The Shadow King was gone, not banished or imprisoned, but truly destroyed, his essence scattered across the void between worlds, where it could never again coalesce into malevolent consciousness. The threat that had haunted the kingdom for generations, that had consumed queens and toppled dynasties, was finally ended. Lyra sank to her knees in the aftermath, the moonblade's light dimming to a gentle glow that spoke of satisfaction rather than readiness for war. Demon caught her before she could fall completely, his arms strong and warm and absolutely real in a world that had briefly threatened to dissolve into nightmare. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and wonder. "It's over." She leaned into his embrace, feeling the mate bond settle into something deeper than attraction or recognition. They had faced the ultimate test together, had proven that their love could literally save the world. "The darkness is gone, the kingdom is safe, and we have earned the right to build something beautiful on the foundation of what we've preserved." Above them, the silver trees swayed in a breeze that carried the promise of spring after the longest winter in living memory. The grove that had witnessed so much death and sacrifice had become a place of rebirth, of hope made manifest through power, guided by perfect love. They had won, not just the battle, not just the war, but the right to write a new story for a kingdom that had been haunted by ancient darkness for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new ways to prove themselves worthy of the crown they had claimed through fire and blood and supernatural grace. But tonight, in the sacred grove where light had triumphed over darkness, they were simply two souls who had found each other across impossible odds and chosen to face the future together, united by moon and storm, as the prophecy had always promised they would be. 6 months had passed since the darkness fell, and the Shadow King met his final end in the sacred grove, and the kingdom had transformed in ways that defied every expectation. The castle that had once felt like a prison of protocol and political necessity had become something else entirely, a place where love and power moved in harmony, where ancient magic flowed through corridors that hummed with contentment rather than conspiracy. Queen Lyra stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly as she watched the sun set over lands that had known nothing but peace since the defeat of the ancient evil. The moonblade hung at her side, no longer a weapon of war, but a symbol of protection, its silver surface gleaming with the soft light of stars reflected in still water. Lost in thought again? Demon's voice carried the warmth of familiar affection as he joined her at the balcony's edge, his arms coming around her from behind in an embrace that had become as natural as breathing. Just thinking about how far we've come. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the mate bond pulse between them with golden satisfaction. 6 months ago I was nobody, a servant who cleaned stalls and hauled water and disappeared into shadows whenever important people walked by. You were never nobody. His lips brushed against her temple, a gentle correction that carried absolute conviction. You were always exactly what you are now, you just hadn't discovered it yet. Through the tall windows behind them came the sound of laughter, the voices of advisers and friends who had gathered for the evening meal. The war room had been converted back to its original purpose, a place for celebration rather than strategy, for fellowship rather than fear. The maps marked with enemy positions had been replaced with architectural plans for new schools and hospitals, with trade routes that would bring prosperity to every corner of the kingdom. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, the question emerging from depths she hadn't known she was exploring. Giving up the political marriage, starting a war with Lady Vivian's family, choosing love over duty? Never. His response was immediate, carrying the kind of certainty that moved mountains and reshaped kingdoms. The war lasted exactly 3 days before her family realised they were fighting against someone who had proven capable of defeating supernatural evil itself. Hard to maintain political opposition when your opponent has literally saved the world. She smiled at the memory of Lady Vivian's formal surrender, delivered with all the grace she could muster, while acknowledging that her family's rebellion had been both brief and futile. There was something to be said for the way legendary status simplified political negotiations. Besides, Demon continued, his hand coming to rest over hers on her growing belly, how could I regret the choice that gave me this, that gave us this? The child stirring beneath their joined hands would carry both bloodlines, would be heir to power that had been separated for 25 years and was now finally reunited. Wolf and moon, storm and starlight, the continuation of a dynasty that had been thought extinct, and the promise of a future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. "I keep thinking about what my grandmother would say," Lyra murmured, her voice soft with wonder and something that might have been grief for the woman who had died protecting the secret that had ultimately saved them all. If she could see what became of the frightened little girl she gave the blade to all those years ago. She would say that she always knew. Demon's certainty wrapped around her like armour forged from love itself. She would say that queens are not born from comfort and certainty, but from fire and necessity and the courage to become what the world needs them to be. The blade at her side pulsed once in agreement, and she could have sworn she felt her grandmother's approval flowing through the ancient metal like a benediction from beyond the grave. The weapon had changed since their victory over the Shadow King, becoming something more symbolic than martial. It no longer sang with readiness for war, but whispered with the satisfaction of a purpose finally fulfilled. "Your Majesty." The voice from the doorway belonged to Marcus, the same steward who had summoned her to serve in the war room all those months ago. But his tone now carried respect that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with genuine admiration for the woman she had become. "The delegation from the Northern Territories has arrived. They are requesting an audience to discuss the trade agreements." "Tell them we'll meet with them after dinner," Lyra replied, the authority in her voice as natural as breathing. "And Marcus, thank you for selecting me that day, for choosing a nobody servant to pour wine at the Alpha King's War Council." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features into something warm and almost paternal. Your Majesty, with all due respect, I never selected you for anything. The request came directly from the Alpha King himself. He specifically asked for the servant girl who worked in the stables, though he wouldn't say why. Lyra turned in Demon's arms, her eyes wide with surprise and dawning understanding. You knew? Even then, you knew there was something different about me? My wolf knew, he admitted, his storm-grey eyes crinkling with amusement at her shock. From the moment I first caught your scent in the castle corridors, my wolf has been telling me that you were important. I just didn't understand why, until I saw you move with that impossible grace, until I touched you and felt the mate bond snap into place like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. So the great coincidence of my selection was no coincidence at all. Was destiny finally getting tired of waiting for us to find each other and deciding to give fate a helping hand? She laughed, the sound bright and clear in the gathering dusk, and through their bond he felt her joy like sunshine after storm. Everything made sense now, every impossible coincidence and convenient accident that had brought them together, despite all the reasons they should never have met. "Come," she said, taking his hand and leading him back toward the warmth and light of their chambers. "Let's have dinner with our friends, discuss trade agreements with dignified diplomacy, and then spend the evening planning the nursery for our impossible child." "Our perfectly possible child," he corrected, following her into the castle that had become their home in every sense of the word. The heir to a love story that rewrote the rules of how kingdoms are supposed to work. As they rejoined their guests, as conversation flowed like wine around a table that had once been the site of desperate war planning, Lyra found herself thinking about the servant girl who had stood in these same halls 6 months ago. The frightened young woman who had been so certain that she was nobody, that she had no place in a world of kings and queens and destiny written in starlight. That girl had been wrong about almost everything. She had never been nobody. She had simply been somebody waiting for the right moment to step into the light. She had never been worthless. She had been priceless, carrying within her the key to mysteries that had shaped kingdoms and the power to save worlds. Most importantly, she had never been alone. Even in her darkest moments, even when she felt most isolated and afraid, she had been moving toward this moment, toward this man, toward this future where love conquered not just personal obstacles, but cosmic ones. "What are you thinking about now?" Demon asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the gentle hum of conversation around them. "I was thinking about a story I heard once," she replied, her hand finding his beneath the table with the automatic grace of long practice. About a servant girl who carried a secret that could remake the world, and an Alpha King who was brave enough to choose love over duty when it mattered most. "And how does that story end?" She smiled, feeling their child stir beneath her heart, and the mate bond pulse between them with golden contentment and the promise of all the tomorrows they would write together. "With happily ever after," she said, and for the first time in her life she believed completely that such endings were not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to claim them. "Some bonds are forged by choice," she whispered, echoing words that felt like they had been written in her heart since the moment she first drew breath. "Others are written in the stars. Ours was both." And in the castle that had witnessed the return of a lost queen, the claiming of a true mate, and the defeat of ancient evil, the future stretched ahead of them bright as starlight and twice as eternal. The war room smelled of leather and steel and something darker that Lyra couldn't name. Power, perhaps, the kind that clung to the walls like smoke and made the air itself feel heavy with consequence. She kept her eyes down as she followed the other servants into the chamber, her hands steady on the silver tray despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. The blade pressed against her thigh like a brand, its ancient metal warm beneath the layers of cloth that hid it from view. She had bound it tighter than usual, desperate to keep it still, but it seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. The circular table dominated the centre of the room, its surface covered with maps, marked in red ink that looked too much like blood. Around it sat the most powerful men in the kingdom, their voices a low rumble of strategic discussion that made her skin crawl with unease. These were alphas, every one of them, their dominance rolling off them in waves that made her wolf press itself flat against her spine in instinctive submission. But it was the man at the head of the table who made her breath catch in her throat. Alpha King Demon Blackthorn commanded attention the way fire commanded oxygen, drawing every eye and every thought toward his presence without effort. He was not the largest man in the room, but somehow he filled more space than the others, his dark hair catching the lamplight as he leaned over a map and traced supply routes with one long finger. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made grown men straighten their shoulders and nod without question. Lyra had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the kingdom had seen him at a distance during ceremonies and processions, but she had never been close enough to feel the weight of his presence, had never been in the same room as the wolf that legends claimed could tear apart armies with his bare hands. She had certainly never been close enough to sense the way her own wolf lifted its head and whined softly, as if recognizing something in him that her human mind refused to acknowledge. "The northern border remains our primary concern," one of the generals was saying, his weathered finger stabbing at a section of map marked with enemy positions. "Their scouts have been seen as far south as Millbrook. If they're testing our defences, they're not testing anything." The Alpha King's voice cut through the discussion like a blade through silk. "They're positioning for a coordinated strike. The question is when, not if." Lyra poured wine into crystal goblets, her movements automatic as she tried to make herself invisible among the men who held the fate of kingdoms in their calloused hands. She had learned the art of disappearing in plain sight, of becoming nothing more than a piece of furniture that happened to carry refreshments. It was a skill that had kept her alive this long, but as she reached across the table to fill the Alpha King's goblet, she felt his attention shift toward her like the sudden focus of a hunting predator. His eyes were the colour of storm clouds, grey and silver, and shot through with flecks of lightning. They fixed on her face with an intensity that made her wolf cower and her human mind go completely blank. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she forgot how to breathe, forgot how to move, forgot everything except the way those eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed mask of civility. "You're new," he said, and even though his voice was quiet, it carried clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. "Yes, Your Majesty." The words came out steady, though she couldn't feel her lips moving. "I was selected today to serve your war council." "Selected?" He repeated the word as if tasting it, testing its weight. His wolf was pressing forward behind his human facade. She could sense it even through her terror, could feel it examining her with an interest that made her skin prickle with awareness. "By whom?" "Marcus, Your Majesty, the head steward." Something flickered in those storm-grey eyes, a shadow of confusion or curiosity that made her stomach clench with fear. Why was he asking questions? Why was he looking at her as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve rather than a servant performing her duties? The blade against her thigh grew warmer, and she bit back a gasp as heat bloomed across her skin. Not now. Not here. She couldn't afford for the ancient magic to stir while she stood under the scrutiny of the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. "Continue with your report, General Morrison." The Alpha King's attention returned to the maps, but Lyra could feel his awareness of her like a weight against her shoulders. Every movement she made seemed to register in his peripheral vision. Every breath she took seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of his wolf's attention. She finished filling the goblets and retreated to the wall where the other servants waited in silent readiness. But even with space between them, even with a table full of alphas and a room full of strategic discussion to buffer her, she could not escape the sense that something had shifted in the balance of the world. The Alpha King's wolf had noticed her, had focused on her with the kind of intensity reserved for prey or threats or something else entirely, something her mind shied away from acknowledging because the implications were too dangerous to consider. She was supposed to be nothing. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to fade into the background like smoke, forgotten the moment she left a room. But the way those storm-grey eyes kept finding her across the chamber suggested she had failed at the most important skill she possessed. The discussion continued around the table, voices rising and falling as strategies were debated and discarded. Lyra tried to focus on the words, tried to lose herself in the tactical conversations that would normally fascinate her despite herself. She had always been drawn to strategy, had always possessed an instinct for warfare that she couldn't explain and didn't dare explore. But tonight, all she could think about was the way the Alpha King's presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, the way his voice sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a recognition her wolf seemed determined to voice despite her desperate attempts to silence it. And worse than all of that was the growing certainty that whatever had drawn his attention, whatever had made his wolf focus on her with such disturbing intensity, it wasn't something she could simply wait out and hope would fade. She was in danger. Not the familiar danger of discovery or exposure, but something far more complex and infinitely more terrifying. The Alpha King had noticed her, and she had the terrible feeling that meant her days of being nothing were numbered. When the meeting finally ended and the generals began filing out with their maps and their grim expressions, Lyra moved to collect the empty goblets with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to remain steady. She was almost finished, almost safe, almost free to retreat to the kitchens and try to make sense of what had happened when that voice stopped her cold. Stay. The single word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Lyra's hands stilled on the crystal she was lifting, her entire body going rigid with a terror that had nothing to do with discovery and everything to do with the impossible situation she suddenly found herself in. The other servants filed out without a backward glance, leaving her alone with the most powerful man in the kingdom and a secret that could get them both killed. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that made the air itself feel dangerous. Lyra stood frozen beside the council table, crystal goblets still clutched in her hands, while the Alpha King rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator who had just cornered his prey. He moved around the table toward her, each step deliberate and measured, and she fought the urge to flee. Running would only confirm whatever suspicions had taken root in his mind. Running would mean questions she couldn't answer and searches she couldn't survive. "What's your name?" His voice was quieter now that they were alone, but somehow that made it more dangerous, like the whisper of steel being drawn from its sheath. "Lyra, your Majesty?" She kept her eyes fixed on the goblet in her hands, watching the way the lamplight caught in the crystal facets. Anywhere but those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see too much. Lyra. He repeated her name the way he had repeated the word selected, rolling it across his tongue as if testing its flavour. "And your family name?" This was where it became dangerous. This was where the careful lies she had constructed could crumble under the weight of his scrutiny. "I have no family name, Your Majesty. I'm orphaned. I was raised in the kitchens after my parents died of fever." The kitchens. He had stopped directly in front of her now, close enough that she could smell the scent that clung to him, something dark and wild that made her wolf lift its head despite her desperate attempts to keep it buried. "Yet you speak like someone who has been educated. Your diction is too refined for a kitchen servant." Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. The blade pressed against her thigh like a coal from a forge, growing warmer with each passing second, and she bit back a gasp as heat bloomed across her skin. Why now? Why did the ancient magic choose this moment to stir when she needed it to remain dormant more than she had ever needed anything in her life? "The cook taught me letters, Your Majesty." She said it would help me serve better if I could read the labels on the spice jars. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was plausible enough. Kitchen servants who could read were useful, even if they were rare. The sound was non-committal, but she could feel his disbelief radiating from him like heat from a flame. And where were you born? Millbrook, Your Majesty. Another lie, delivered with the same steady voice that had served her so well over the years. She had been born in the capital, in rooms that had once belonged to queens, but Millbrook was far enough away that no one would think to verify her claim. Millbrook. His voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement, but when she dared to glance up at his face, his expression was unreadable. The same village that sits directly in the path of our enemy's advance. How fortunate that you escaped before the troubles began. The goblet slipped from her nerveless fingers and would have shattered on the stone floor, but her hand shot out with reflexes too quick for a kitchen servant, too graceful for someone who had spent her life hauling water and scrubbing floors. She caught the crystal before it could fall, her movement so fluid and precise that it looked like a dance step from some ancient ceremony. The Alpha King went very still. Lyra's blood turned to ice as she realized what she had just done. No servant moved like that. No one who had been raised in kitchens possessed that kind of trained grace, that warrior's instinct that had turned a clumsy accident into a display of supernatural reflexes. "Interesting," he said, and the word fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. "That was very interesting indeed." She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The blade against her thigh was burning now, responding to her terror with a heat that threatened to sear through the cloth that concealed it. She could feel ancient magic stirring in her bloodstream, awakening after years of careful suppression, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying out at the sensation. "Your Majesty, I should return to the kitchens." Her voice sounded thin and distant, as if it were coming from very far away. "The staff will be wondering where I am." "Will they?" He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't move, couldn't move, his fingers brushed against her chin and tilted her face up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "I don't think the kitchens are wondering about you at all, Lyra with no family name. I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The touch of his skin against hers sent electricity racing through her veins, a shock of connection so powerful it made her gasp aloud. For a moment that felt like eternity, she saw something flicker in those storm-grey eyes, a recognition that went deeper than logic and straight into the primal place where wolves knew their own. Her wolf lifted its head and howled, not aloud, not where he could hear it, but the sound echoed through her bones and her blood and the secret places of her soul. It was a sound of greeting, of recognition, of something far too dangerous to acknowledge while she stood in a room with the most powerful man in the kingdom and secrets that could destroy them both. "I don't understand," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie. She understood too well. She understood exactly what that flicker in his eyes meant, exactly why her wolf was singing with joy despite her terror, exactly why the blade against her thigh was burning with approval. Mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf, or from the ancient presence that seemed to be awakening in her blood, or from somewhere else entirely. Mate, 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 until the syllables lost all meaning and became nothing but a heartbeat of impossible recognition. "Don't you?" His thumb brushed across her cheek, and she felt the tremor that ran through his own hand, felt the way his control wavered for just an instant before snapping back into place. "I think you understand perfectly. The question is what we're going to do about it." Before she could respond, before she could find words to deny what was happening between them, or voice to protest the impossibility of it all, the great doors of the council chamber swung open with enough force to rattle the hinges. "Demon, darling, there you are." The voice that cut through the tension was honey-sweet and sharp as a blade. carrying the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of having doors opened and paths cleared without question. Lady Vivian Ashworth stepped into the chamber like she owned it, her golden hair catching the lamplight and her blue eyes bright with the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their own feet. She was everything Lyra was not, elegant where Lyra was plain, refined where Lyra was common, legitimate where Lyra was bastard-born and nameless. She wore her nobility like armour, her bloodline like a crown, and as her gaze swept the room and found Lyra standing entirely too close to the man she was set to marry, her smile sharpened into something that promised retribution. The Alpha King's hand dropped away from Lyra's face as if he had been burned. The spell that had held them frozen in that moment of impossible recognition shattered like crystal hitting stone, and Lyra felt the loss of his touch like a physical blow. "Vivian!" His voice was carefully neutral, but Lyra could hear the frustration beneath it, could sense the way his wolf bristled at the interruption. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I wanted to surprise you." Lady Vivian glided across the chamber with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained from birth to command attention, but her eyes never left Lyra's face. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important?" The question was aimed at Lyra like an arrow, delivered with the kind of smile that managed to be both beautiful and threatening at the same time. It was a test, a challenge, a warning all wrapped up in silk and presented with perfect courtesy. "Not at all, my lady." Lyra dropped into the deepest curtsy she could manage, using the movement to hide the way her hands shook and to put some desperately needed distance between herself and the Alpha King. "I was just finishing my duties." "How thorough of you!" Lady Vivian's smile widened, but it never reached her eyes. "I'm sure the Kitchens are grateful to have such a dedicated servant." The dismissal was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never doubted her own superiority. Lyra gathered the remaining goblets with hands that trembled despite her best efforts, acutely aware of the way both sets of eyes followed her movement, the way the tension in the room shifted and coiled like a living thing. As she reached the door, she risked one glance back and found the Alpha King watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Something passed between them in that look, a promise or a threat or a recognition that this was far from over. Then the door closed behind her, and she was alone in the corridor with a secret that felt too large for her chest, and the terrible certainty that her days of being invisible had just come to an end. The morning arrived with cruel efficiency, bringing with it the kind of pale sunlight that made shadows look deeper and secrets feel more dangerous. Lyra had not slept. She had spent the night pacing her tiny servants' quarters, the blade against her thigh burning with a heat that never seemed to fade, her wolf restless and whining beneath her skin like a caged animal that had caught the scent of freedom. Everything had changed in that moment when the Alpha King's fingers touched her face. Everything had shifted when she saw recognition flicker in those storm-grey eyes, when her wolf had lifted its head and howled with a joy she didn't dare acknowledge. She was no longer invisible, no longer safe in the anonymity that had protected her for so long, and Lady Vivian had seen it all. The thought sent ice through her veins as she made her way through the servants' corridors, keeping her head down and her steps silent. She had learned to read people during her years of invisibility, had developed an instinct for the subtle cruelties that powerful women wielded like weapons. The smile Lady Vivian had worn when she found Lyra alone with her intended husband was not the expression of a woman who would forget or forgive. It was the smile of a predator who had just selected her prey. "There you are." The voice made her blood freeze. Lady Vivian stepped out of an alcove like she had been waiting, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her blue silk gown making her look like something from a fairy tale, beautiful and terrible and absolutely lethal. "My lady." Lyra dropped into a curtsy, but she could feel those ice-blue eyes studying her face, cataloguing every expression, every tell that might reveal what had passed between her and the Alpha King in those charged moments before the interruption. Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Lady Vivian turned and glided down the corridor toward the storage rooms, her silk slippers making no sound on the stone floor. Lyra had no choice but to follow, her heart hammering against her ribs as they moved deeper into the castle, farther from any help or witnesses. The storage room smelled of dust and disuse, filled with furniture covered in white sheets and tapestries that had fallen out of favour. Lady Vivian closed the door behind them with a soft click that sounded like a death knell in the sudden silence. "You're very pretty," Lady Vivian said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "In a common sort of way, I suppose. I can see why a man might find you diverting." The word dripped with contempt. Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "I don't know what you mean, my lady." "Don't you?" Lady Vivian circled her like a shark, scenting blood in the water. "I saw the way he was looking at you, the way you were looking at him. It was quite intimate." "I was serving wine, my lady, nothing more." The sound was filled with disbelief and something darker. "You know, servants who forget their place often meet with unfortunate accidents. Kitchen fires, falls down steep stairs, sudden illnesses that no healer can cure. Such tragic losses, but these things do happen." The threat was delivered with the same conversational tone, wrapped in silk but sharp as a blade. Lyra felt her wolf bristle at the casual mention of violence, felt something ancient and fierce stir in her chest that whispered she didn't have to endure this, didn't have to bow and scrape before this golden predator who thought nobility gave her the right to threaten and intimidate. But revealing that strength would mean death, so she crushed it down and maintained her pose of subservient terror. "I understand, my lady." "Do you? I wonder." Lady Vivian stopped directly in front of her, close enough that Lyra could smell her expensive perfume, could see the calculation in those beautiful blue eyes. "You see, I've been asking questions about you, little mouse, and do you know what I've discovered?" Lyra's blood turned to ice. Questions, investigations. This was how it always began, how secrets were dragged into the light and turned into weapons. "No one seems to know where you came from," Lady Vivian continued, her voice soft as velvet and twice as dangerous. "Oh, there are stories, of course. Kitchen foundling, fever orphan, the usual sad tales servants tell to explain their existence, but nothing that can be verified, nothing that can be traced." "I'm nobody, my lady. There's nothing to trace." "Nobody." Lady Vivian laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "How interesting that you should phrase it that way, because my attendant mentioned the most curious thing this morning. She said the castle mages have been detecting unusual magical disturbances, faint traces of very old power, the kind that shouldn't exist anymore." The blade against Lyra's thigh flared with sudden heat, responding to her terror with a surge of ancient magic that she desperately tried to suppress. Not here, not now. She couldn't afford for the weapon to reveal itself when Lady Vivian was already asking the exact questions that could get them both killed. "I wouldn't know anything about magic, my lady." "Wouldn't you?" Lady Vivian's smile sharpened. "The thing about old magic is that it leaves traces, signatures, and those signatures can be tracked by someone who knows what to look for." Terror clawed up Lyra's throat. If the castle mages were detecting magical disturbances, if they had ways to trace the source, then her carefully constructed invisibility was nothing more than an illusion. The blade she had carried in secret for 3 years was betraying her with every beat of her heart, every spike of emotion that made the ancient metal sing with power. "I think," Lady Vivian said, stepping so close that Lyra could see the flecks of silver in her blue eyes, "that you and I need to come to an understanding. You are going to stay away from my intended husband. You are going to perform your duties with your eyes down and your mouth shut, and you are going to remember that servants who develop ideas above their station tend to disappear." "Yes, my lady." "Good." Lady Vivian's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Because if I have to have this conversation again, it will be our last conversation. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly, my lady." "Excellent. You may go." Lyra fled. There was no other word for it. She ran from that storage room like her life depended on it, because it probably did. Lady Vivian had all but confessed to murdering servants who threatened her position, and she had made it clear that Lyra was now firmly in that category. But worse than the threats was the knowledge that the blade's magic was detectable. If the castle mages could sense the ancient power, if they had ways to track its source, then it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection between the magical disturbances and the servant girl who had appeared from nowhere. She needed answers. She needed to understand what she was carrying and why it was growing stronger, needed to know if there was any way to suppress its power before it betrayed her completely. The castle's ancient armoury was housed in the lowest levels, in chambers carved from the living rock that predated the current structure by centuries. It was a place few servants had reason to visit, a repository of weapons and armour from forgotten wars and fallen kingdoms. If answers existed anywhere, they would be here among the relics of the past. The heavy wooden door opened with a groan of protest, releasing air that tasted of metal and dust and something else, something that made her wolf lift its head with sudden interest. The blade against her thigh pulsed once, a single throb of recognition that sent heat racing through her veins. The armoury was larger than she had expected, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow above rows of weapon racks and armour stands. Most of the pieces were mundane, well-crafted, but unremarkable weapons from the kingdom's military history. But as she moved deeper into the chamber, following the blade's increasingly insistent pull, she began to see older things, stranger things. A sword with runes carved into its crossguard that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. A shield bearing the crest of a house she didn't recognise, its surface reflecting images that weren't there. A helm crowned with silver that whispered when she passed. And there, in a dusty corner behind a rack of spears, she found what she was looking for. The record book was bound in leather that had once been white but had aged to the colour of old bones. Its pages were filled with careful script, documenting the provenance of every weapon in the royal collection, and as she turned through the yellowed parchment with trembling fingers, she found the entry that made her heart stop. Moonblade of House Silvermoon, last seen in the possession of Queen Seraphina Silvermoon before the fall of the Moonstone dynasty. Blade of star-forged silver awakens only for its true heir. Said to sing with the voice of the ancient moon goddess when wielded by those of the blood. Status: lost, presumed destroyed with the fall of the royal house. Lost, presumed destroyed, but not destroyed at all, because it was pressed against her thigh at this very moment, its heat a constant reminder of the impossible heritage she carried. The blade only awakens for its true heir. The words echoed in her mind as she closed the book with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. True heir. Not just someone who had happened to inherit an old sword, not just a servant girl whose grandmother had passed down a family relic. True heir to a bloodline everyone believed extinct, to a dynasty that had fallen in fire and betrayal 25 years ago. True heir to a throne that no longer existed. She was still staring at the closed book when she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy boots, confident stride, the measured pace of someone who belonged in the castle's depths. She had just enough time to shove the record book back into its place before the armoury door swung open and torchlight spilled across the stone floor. "I thought I might find you here." The voice that cut through the shadows made every muscle in her body go rigid with recognition and terror and something else, something that made her wolf lift its head with desperate hope. The Alpha King stood in the doorway like an avatar of controlled power, his storm-grey eyes finding her in the darkness with the unerring precision of a hunter who had been tracking his prey. And from the expression on his face, she had the terrible feeling that he had just realised exactly what he had been hunting all along. The torch in the Alpha King's hand cast dancing shadows across the ancient weapons, making the armory feel alive with whispered secrets and forgotten wars. Lyra pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it echoing through the vaulted chamber. "Your Majesty." The words came out as barely more than a breath. "I was just looking for answers." His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of certainty that made arguing pointless. He stepped into the armory fully, closing the door behind him with a soft click that made her flinch. "The same answers I've been seeking since yesterday evening." He moved through the chamber like he owned it, which of course he did, but there was something different about the way he carried himself down here among the relics of the past. Less king, more hunter, less ceremonial authority, more primal predator following a scent that had driven him to distraction. "I don't understand, Your Majesty." "Don't you?" He set the torch in a wall sconce and turned to face her fully, those storm-grey eyes catching the flame light and reflecting it back like polished steel. "Then perhaps you can explain why my wolf has been pacing all night, why I can sense your presence from 3 floors away, why every instinct I possess is telling me that the servant girl from my war council is far more than she appears to be." The blade against her thigh flared with sudden heat, responding to his proximity with a surge of ancient magic that made her gasp aloud. The sound echoed off the stone walls, and she saw his eyes narrow with predatory focus at her obvious distress. "You're in pain," he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that sounded almost like concern. "Something is causing you physical discomfort. What are you hiding, Lyra with no family name?" Everything. She was hiding everything, from the blade that marked her as heir to a fallen dynasty, to the wolf that recognized him as mate, to the terror that threatened to consume her from the inside out. But she couldn't say any of that, couldn't voice the truths that would destroy them both. "Nothing, Your Majesty. I'm hiding nothing." "Liar." The word was said without heat, almost gently, but it hit her like a physical blow. "You're lying to me, and we both know it. The question is why." He began to circle her then, moving with that fluid predator's grace that made her wolf whine with recognition and submission. Each step brought him closer to the truth she desperately needed to conceal, each moment of his scrutiny peeling away another layer of the careful invisibility that had protected her for so long. "Tell me about your parents," he said, his voice conversational despite the tension that crackled between them like lightning before a storm. "The ones who died of fever. Tell me their names." Another test, another trap. If she gave him names, he could verify them. If she refused to answer, her silence would be as damning as any confession. "Thomas and Mary, Your Majesty. They were nobody important." "Thomas and Mary." He repeated the common names with the same careful attention he had given everything else about her story. "And they taught you nothing of your heritage? No family stories, no ancestral tales?" "We had no heritage to speak of, Your Majesty." He had stopped circling and now stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that wild scent that made her wolf press against her skin with desperate longing. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were in this armory. What were you looking for among weapons that predate the current dynasty by centuries?" Her throat went dry. She had no answer for that, no reasonable explanation for why a kitchen servant would be searching through military records in the castle's deepest chambers. Any lie she told would only dig her deeper into a trap she could already feel closing around her. "I was curious, Your Majesty. I've never seen such old weapons." Curious. He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't move, couldn't move, his fingers brushed against her cheek the same way they had in the war room. The same electric shock raced through her veins, but this time it was stronger, more insistent, carrying with it a recognition that made her wolf throw back its head and howl. "Curious about weapons you shouldn't know existed, in a place you have no reason to visit, looking for answers to questions you claim not to have." The touch of his skin against hers sent fire racing through her bloodstream, and with it came something else, something that made her gasp and stumble backward until her shoulders hit the stone wall. Images, flashes of memory that weren't hers, scenes from a past she had never lived. A woman with silver hair and eyes like starlight standing beside a man whose wolf radiated alpha dominance. A blade singing as it cut through enemies who threatened the kingdom. A crown of silver and moonstone being placed on a head that looked disturbingly like her own. "What did you just see?" The Alpha King's voice was sharp with demand, and when she forced her eyes open, she found him staring at her with an intensity that stole her breath. The touch triggered something. "What did you see?" "Nothing." But even as she said it, she knew the lie was useless. He had felt it too, had sensed the magic that sparked between them when skin met skin. There was no hiding from the supernatural connection that seemed to grow stronger every time they were in the same space. "The records speak of old magic," he said quietly, but there was steel beneath the soft words. Bloodlines that carried power in their veins, dynasties that ruled through supernatural right as much as political might. The Moonstone dynasty was said to possess such gifts. Her heart stopped. The Moonstone dynasty, her dynasty. The royal house that had ruled alongside the Alpha Kings until fire and betrayal brought it crashing down, leaving only ash and legend in its wake. "That was 25 years ago, Your Majesty. Everyone knows the Silver Moon line died with Queen Seraphina." "Everyone believes that, yes." His eyes never left her face, cataloguing every micro-expression, every tell that might reveal the truth she was so desperately trying to conceal. But what if everyone was wrong? What if someone survived the fall? A child, perhaps, spirited away in the chaos and raised in hiding until the time came to reclaim what was stolen. The blade against her thigh was burning now, responding to the proximity of truth with a heat that threatened to sear through cloth and skin alike. She pressed her lips together to keep from crying out, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air of the underground chamber. "That's just legend, Your Majesty, stories told to make tragedy more romantic." "Is it?" He leaned closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough that his breath ghosted across her cheek when he spoke. "Then tell me why my wolf recognizes you. Tell me why touching you feels like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Tell me why every instinct I possess is screaming that you are exactly what my kingdom has been missing for 25 years. "Mate," her wolf whispered, the word echoing through her bones and blood like a prayer. "Queen," the blade sang against her skin, its voice harmonizing with her wolf's recognition until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Home," her heart whispered, and that was the most dangerous word of all. "I'm nobody," she said again, but the words felt hollow now, emptied of conviction by the weight of truth pressing against her chest. "I'm nobody special. Nobody." His thumb brushed across her cheek, and this time she couldn't stop the shiver that ran through her at the contact. "You keep saying that word like it means something, like it's armour you can hide behind." The touch triggered another flash of memory, stronger this time, more vivid. She saw herself standing in this very armoury, but older, wearing silver armour that gleamed like starlight. Saw herself lifting a blade that sang with moonlight, while a man with storm-grey eyes watched with pride and love, and something deeper than either. She saw herself crowned, not as a servant who had risen above her station, but as a queen returning to claim her birthright. "Stop!" she gasped, pulling away from his touch, before the visions could show her more, before they could reveal truths that would get them both killed. "Please, Your Majesty, just stop." But it was too late. She could see in his eyes that he had felt it too, had sensed the power that flowed between them when their skin met, had glimpsed the same impossible future that the magic insisted on showing her. His wolf was fully present now, pressing against his human facade with recognition that could not be denied or reasoned away. "You're her," he said, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that moved mountains and toppled kingdoms. "You're the lost heir, the Moonstone Queen who was supposed to rule beside the Alpha Kings." "No." The word tore from her throat like a sob. "No, I'm not. I can't be." "You are." He reached for her again, but this time she was ready. This time she dodged away from his touch and ran, fleeing through the armory like her life depended on it. Because it did. Behind her, she heard him call her name, heard the command in his voice that should have stopped her in her tracks. But she was beyond hearing, beyond obeying, beyond anything except the desperate need to escape before the truth buried her completely. She ran through corridors and upstairs, past startled servants and through chambers she had no business entering, until she reached her tiny quarters and slammed the door behind her with enough force to rattle the hinges. Only then, alone in the darkness with her secret and her terror, and the blade that sang with approval against her skin, did she allow herself to collapse. The Alpha King knew what she was, and there was nowhere left to run. The moonlight turned the castle gardens into a landscape of silver and shadow, where every hedge became a place to hide, and every path led deeper into the labyrinth of her own making. Lyra had fled here after 3 sleepless hours in her quarters, driven by a restlessness that felt like her skin was too small to contain the truth that wanted to claw its way out of her chest. The blade pressed against her thigh with a heat that never seemed to fade, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat like a second pulse that belonged to someone she was too terrified to become. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those visions, those impossible memories of a woman who looked like her, standing beside a man whose eyes held storms and starlight in equal measure. She had found the most secluded corner of the gardens, a place where ancient rose bushes grew wild and untamed around a stone bench that had been forgotten by everyone except the moonlight. Here, at least, she could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in, could try to make sense of the impossible situation that seemed to grow more dangerous with every passing hour. "I wondered if I'd find you here." The voice that cut through the silence made her heart stop and restart with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a recognition that went deeper than logic. She turned to find the Alpha King emerging from the shadows between the rose bushes, his dark hair catching the moonlight and his storm-grey eyes reflecting the silver glow like polished steel. He was not dressed as a king tonight. Gone were the ceremonial robes and crown of authority, replaced by simple dark clothing that made him look less like a ruler and more like the predator his wolf truly was. But somehow that only made him more dangerous, more compelling, more impossible to resist. "Your Majesty!" She started to rise from the bench, started to drop into the curtsy that protocol demanded, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't!" His voice was quiet, intimate in a way that sent shivers racing down her spine. "Don't curtsy to me, don't call me by my title, don't pretend that what happened between us in the armory was nothing more than a servant addressing her king." She sank back onto the bench, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white in the moonlight. "I don't know what you want me to say." "The truth." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of a night spent wrestling with revelations that changed everything. "Just once, I want you to tell me the truth." "I've told you the truth." "Have you?" He sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent filled her senses and made her wolf whine with desperate longing. "Then tell me why I haven't been able to sleep. Tell me why my wolf has been pacing like a caged animal, why every instinct I possess is telling me to find you and never let you out of my sight again." The honesty in his voice broke something loose in her chest, some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back a flood of emotions she didn't know how to name. She turned to look at him fully for the first time, really look at him, and what she saw in those storm-grey eyes made her breath catch in her throat. Loneliness. The same bone-deep isolation that had been her constant companion for 23 years, the same ache of being the only one of your kind in a world that would destroy you if it knew what you truly were. "You're lonely," she said, and the words came out softer than she had intended, filled with a recognition that went beyond her careful training in invisibility. "Always?" The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I have been alone since the day I took the crown, surrounded by people, but utterly isolated by the weight of what I am, what I represent. And then yesterday you walked into my war room, and for the first time in my life my wolf lifted its head and said, 'Home.' Home!" The word hit her like a physical blow, because she had felt it too, had recognised something in him that called to the deepest parts of her soul, despite every rational reason to run in the opposite direction. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel the lie crumbling under the weight of truth that pressed against her chest like a living thing. "Is it?" He turned toward her on the bench, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his eyes, close enough that when he reached out to touch her face, she didn't have the strength to pull away. "My wolf has never responded to anyone the way it responds to you, never recognised anyone as pack, as family, as—" He trailed off, but she could hear the word he didn't say, hanging in the air between them like a challenge to everything she thought she knew about the world. "Mate." "This is madness," she said, but her voice shook with something that might have been hope, and when his thumb brushed across her cheek, she leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Complete madness. You're a servant with no name and no family. I'm a king bound by political necessity to marry for the good of the kingdom. There is no scenario in which this makes sense." "Then why—" "Because nothing else has ever made sense the way this does." His other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly, as if she were something precious that might shatter if handled too roughly. "Because when I touch you, I remember what it feels like to be whole." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise, as natural as breathing, as right as everything else in her life had been wrong. His lips were warm and firm against hers, gentle at first, testing, asking permission. But when she gasped against his mouth, when her hands came up to fist in the fabric of his shirt, the kiss deepened into something that felt like claiming and surrender all at once. Magic flared between them, bright as starlight and twice as powerful. The blade against her thigh sang with sudden joy, its ancient metal warming until she could feel its approval through every layer of cloth that bound it to her skin. Golden lights sparkled in the air around them, visible threads of connection that pulsed with each shared breath, each racing heartbeat. The mate bond. She could see it now, could feel it settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Golden threads that wound around her heart and his, binding them together with a strength that made kingdoms seem fragile and temporary by comparison. He pulled back with a gasp, his eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. What was that light, that feeling? The mate bond. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, an admission that changed everything and could never be taken back. "You're my mate, mate." He repeated the word like he was testing its weight, and she could see the exact moment when understanding hit him, when the implications of what had just happened between them crashed over him like a wave. "You're my mate and you're—" He didn't finish the sentence, but she could see the knowledge in his eyes, the recognition that had been building since the moment they first touched. She was his mate, and she was the lost queen, the missing piece of a puzzle that had been incomplete for 25 years. "I can't be," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I can't be your mate. I can't be a queen. I can't be anything except what I am. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I'm—" "Mine." The word came out with such fierce certainty that it stopped her protests cold. You're mine and I'm yours, and nothing else matters. Everything else matters! She pulled away from him, putting distance between them, even though every instinct she possessed screamed at her to stay close, to let him hold her until the world made sense again. You're engaged to Lady Vivian. You have duties to the kingdom. You can't just, I can do whatever I choose. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no, who had spent his entire life having his word accepted as law. I am the Alpha King, and if I choose to break a political engagement in favour of a true mate bond, then that is exactly what I will do. And start a war? The question came out sharper than she had intended, but she could see the truth of it in his eyes, could see the exact moment when political reality crashed back over him like cold water. Lady Vivian's family commands 3 of the most powerful houses in the kingdom. If you reject her publicly, if you humiliate her by choosing a servant over the alliance she represents, then we'll deal with the consequences. But she could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice, could see the weight of kingship settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. Will we? She stood from the bench, putting more distance between them, because proximity made it impossible to think clearly, impossible to see beyond the golden glow of the bond that wanted to consume everything else. Or will I be found dead in my quarters tomorrow morning while you marry Lady Vivian and tell yourself it was for the good of the kingdom? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. She could see him flinch, could see the way his wolf recoiled from the suggestion that he would choose duty over the mate bond that had just completed between them. You think I would let them hurt you? His voice was soft, dangerous, filled with the kind of controlled fury that made her remember exactly what kind of predator lurked beneath his human skin. You think I would stand by and watch while they destroyed the other half of my soul? I think you're a king first and everything else second. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced them out anyway, because one of them had to be practical, had to remember that fairy tales didn't exist in a world where political necessity trumped personal desire. I think when morning comes and you remember what breaking that engagement would cost your kingdom, you'll make the choice that keeps your people safe. And what about what it would cost me? He stood as well, moving toward her with that predator's grace that made her wolf whimper with recognition and longing. What about what it would cost us? There is no us. But even as she said it, she could feel the lie burning her throat, could feel the golden threads of the mate bond pulling tight with protest. There can't be an us. Can't there? He reached for her again, but this time she was ready. This time she stepped back before his touch could shatter what remained of her resolve. I have to go. The words came out in a rush, driven by panic and heartbreak and the terrible certainty that staying would only make the inevitable goodbye more devastating. I have to leave before... Before what? Before we figure out how to make this work? Before we find a way to claim what's ours by right? Before they kill me for daring to reach above my station. She was backing away from him now, putting the safety of distance between them, even though every step felt like tearing away pieces of her own heart. Before Lady Vivian decides that accidents happen to servants who forget their place. His eyes went flat and cold at the mention of his intended bride, and for a moment she glimpsed the alpha that had earned his crown through strength and cunning rather than birthright alone. She threatened you. It wasn't a question. She could see in his face that he had already guessed, had probably suspected from the moment Lady Vivian interrupted them in the war room. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. He took another step toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him, and something in her expression made him freeze in place. Don't. Her voice broke on the word, but she forced herself to continue. Don't make this harder than it already is. Don't make me hope for things that can't exist. They can exist. We can make them exist. No. She shook her head, silver tears tracking down her cheeks in the moonlight. "We can't. You're the Alpha King and I'm nobody. That's the truth. No matter what your wolf thinks it recognizes, no matter what magic sparked between us, that's the only truth that matters." She turned and ran then, fleeing through the garden paths like her life depended on it. Behind her, she heard him call her name, heard the command in his voice that should have brought her to heel. But she was beyond hearing, beyond obeying, beyond anything except the desperate need to escape before the mate bond dragged her back into his arms where she belonged, where she could never stay. The great hall had never felt more like a trap than it did in the pale light of dawn, its vaulted ceiling and stone walls closing in around Lyra like the jaws of some ancient predator. She stood at the servants' entrance with her hands clasped behind her back, watching as the most powerful people in the kingdom took their places for the morning assembly, and tried to convince herself that the dread pooling in her stomach was nothing more than exhaustion. She had not slept after fleeing the gardens, had spent the hours before sunrise pacing her quarters like a caged animal, the mate bond pulling at her chest with every breath, the blade against her thigh burning with an approval that felt like betrayal. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to disappear into the countryside before the trap she could feel, closing around her, snapped shut completely. But servants who fled without permission were hunted down like criminals, and servants who carried stolen royal artifacts were executed as traitors. So she stood in the shadows and watched the assembled court, noting the way conversations stopped when certain people entered, cataloguing the subtle power plays and political manoeuvring that would determine the fate of kingdoms. She had learned to read these currents during her years of invisibility, had developed an instinct for the dangerous undercurrents that ran beneath courtly politeness. This morning those currents felt like a riptide about to drag her under. Lady Vivian entered the hall like she owned it, her golden hair arranged in elaborate braids that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She wore blue silk that matched her eyes and a smile that promised retribution to anyone who had dared cross her. When her gaze swept the assembled servants and found Lyra lurking in the shadows, that smile sharpened into something that made her wolf press flat against her spine in instinctive terror. "Ah, there you are, little mouse." Lady Vivian's voice carried clearly across the hall, drawing every eye toward the corner where Lyra stood frozen. "I was hoping you would be here for this." The words sent ice through Lyra's veins. This, whatever Lady Vivian had planned, whatever trap she had spent the night constructing, it was about to be sprung in front of the entire court, in front of witnesses who would remember every detail, who would spread the story until it became legend. The Alpha King entered then, and the hall fell silent in the way that only true power could command. He wore the full regalia of his office, crown and ceremonial robes that made him look like something from the old stories, like the kind of king who could move mountains with a word and reshape kingdoms with a gesture. But when his storm-grey eyes found her across the crowded hall, she saw the man from the gardens, the one who had kissed her until golden light danced in the air between them. She saw her mate, and the recognition in his gaze made her chest tighten with longing and terror in equal measure. "My lords and ladies," Lady Vivian said, her voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a blade. "Before we begin today's proceedings, I believe there is a matter of castle security that requires immediate attention." Lyra's blood turned to ice. Security, the word that preceded searches and interrogations and all the other ways powerful people dismantled the lives of those who threatened them. "Lady Vivian," the Alpha King said, and there was a warning in his voice that anyone with sense would have heeded. "Perhaps this matter could be addressed privately." "Oh, but your Majesty, I believe the entire court should witness this." Lady Vivian's smile was all teeth and malice. "You see, it has come to my attention that we may have a spy among our servants, someone who has been gathering information about our military preparations, someone who may be passing that information to our enemies. The accusation hit the hall like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, voices rising with shock and speculation. Spies were hanged, spies were tortured first, then hanged. The very suggestion was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. "That's a serious charge," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men straighten their shoulders. "Do you have evidence to support this accusation?" "I do indeed." Lady Vivian gestured to one of her attendants, who stepped forward carrying a small leather pouch that made Lyra's heart stop completely. This was found hidden in the quarters of one of our kitchen servants, a servant who, despite her humble origins, somehow gained access to your private war council. "No," the word screamed through Lyra's mind as she recognized the pouch, recognized the careful way it had been wrapped and hidden among her few possessions. It was the same pouch that had held her grandmother's letters, the ones that detailed the fall of the Moonstone dynasty and the bloodline that had been thought extinct. Lady Vivian had planted it, had somehow gained access to her quarters during the night and placed evidence that would damn her beyond redemption. Evidence that would prove she was exactly what they accused her of being, a threat to the kingdom's security. "The servant's name is Lyra," Lady Vivian continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "She claims to be an orphan from Millbrook, but these documents suggest otherwise." The attendant opened the pouch and withdrew papers that Lyra had never seen before, letters written in a hand she didn't recognize. But from the distance, from the way the assembled court leaned forward to hear the accusations, she knew they would be damning, would paint her as exactly the kind of enemy agent that justified immediate and brutal retaliation. "Bring her forward," Lady Vivian commanded, and suddenly there were guards moving toward her, men in royal livery who looked like they would enjoy the violence that was about to unfold. Lyra's wolf snarled, finally lifting its head after years of careful suppression. The blade against her thigh flared with sudden heat, responding to her terror with a surge of ancient magic that made her gasp aloud. She could run, could try to fight her way through the guards and escape into the castle's corridors, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the trap that had been so carefully constructed around her. "Wait!" The single word cut through the hall like a blade through silk, carrying such absolute authority that even the advancing guards stopped in their tracks. The Alpha King stepped down from his throne, moving with that predator's grace that made him seem larger than his physical form, more dangerous than any weapon. "These are serious accusations, Lady Vivian. If this servant is indeed a spy, then she should be properly searched before the evidence is presented. We wouldn't want there to be any question about the legitimacy of your claims." Something flickered in Lady Vivian's eyes, a moment of uncertainty that suggested this was not how she had expected the scene to unfold. "Of course, Your Majesty. A search is precisely what I was about to suggest." "Good." His smile was sharp as winter frost. "Then I'm sure you won't object if I conduct the search myself. After all, if she is carrying evidence of treason, it's only appropriate that the king himself should witness its discovery." "Your Majesty," Lady Vivian started, but he was already moving toward Lyra, already crossing the space between them with purposeful strides that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the storm brewing in his grey eyes, close enough that his presence filled her senses and made her wolf whine with recognition. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Trust me." The words were barely more than a breath, but they carried such certainty that something loosened in her chest. Whatever was about to happen, whatever trap Lady Vivian had constructed, he was not going to let her face it alone. His hands moved to her shoulders, ostensibly beginning the search that protocol demanded, but really sending reassurance through the mate bond that pulsed between them like a heartbeat. She could feel his wolf pressing against his human facade, could sense the barely controlled fury that radiated from him at the thought of anyone threatening his mate. and then his hands moved lower, following the lines of her simple servant's dress with a thoroughness that made the watching court murmur with interest. When his fingers brushed against her thigh, against the place where the blade lay hidden beneath layers of cloth, she felt him go completely still. He had found it, had found the weapon that would prove she was exactly what Lady Vivian claimed, and so much worse. Had found the evidence that would see her executed before the sun set. But instead of pulling away, instead of exposing the blade that would damn them both, his hand pressed against the hidden weapon with a touch that sent fire racing through her veins. And in that moment of contact, with ancient magic singing between them, and the mate bond flaring like golden fire, she felt him recognize exactly what she carried: the moonblade, the weapon of queens, the proof of a bloodline that was supposed to be extinct. When he straightened and turned back to face the court, his expression was perfectly neutral, giving nothing away of the earth-shattering revelation that had just occurred between them. "I find no evidence of weapons or treasonous materials," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "This servant appears to be exactly what she claims, a kitchen worker with no political affiliations." Lady Vivian's face went white with shock and fury. "But, Your Majesty, the documents—" "Can be forged by anyone with sufficient motivation and access to the proper materials." His voice carried such finality that even she seemed to recognize the futility of arguing. "Unless you have additional evidence beyond papers that could have been planted by anyone with access to the servants' quarters." The implication was clear, delivered with the kind of subtle threat that made Lady Vivian's attendant take an involuntary step backward. The Alpha King was suggesting that she had fabricated the evidence, had constructed the entire accusation from nothing more than jealousy and malice. "Of course not, Your Majesty." Lady Vivian's voice was tight with barely controlled rage, but she was trapped by the very public nature of her own accusation. To push further would be to openly question the king's judgment, and that was a line even she didn't dare cross. "Then this matter is closed." He turned back to Lyra, and in his eyes she saw a promise that sent shivers down her spine. "You may return to your duties." She curtsied deeply, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. As she straightened, she caught his gaze one more time and saw the storm building there, saw the fury and recognition and something else that made her wolf throw back its head and howl with joy. He knew what she was, he knew what she carried, and instead of exposing her, instead of using the knowledge to secure his own political position, he had protected her. He had chosen her over duty, over politics, over everything that should have mattered more than the mate bond that pulsed between them like a living thing. As she fled the great hall on trembling legs, she heard Lady Vivian's voice rise in protest, heard the Alpha King's cold dismissal of her concerns. But all of that faded into background noise compared to the single truth that echoed through her bones and blood and the secret places of her soul. Her mate had claimed her, had chosen her, had looked into the face of political disaster and decided that she was worth the risk. The only question now was what they were going to do about it. The private chambers of the Alpha King had never seen a servant cross their threshold uninvited, but Lyra found herself there nonetheless, summoned by a message that had arrived with her evening meal and carried the kind of authority that made refusal impossible. The room was vast and intimidating, filled with the weight of power and the scent of the man who commanded kingdoms with a word. He stood with his back to her when she entered, silhouetted against the tall windows that overlooked the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The ceremonial robes were gone, replaced by simple dark clothing that made him look less like a king and more like the predator his wolf truly was. When he turned to face her, the storm in his grey eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "Close the door," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. She did as commanded, the soft click of the latch falling into place, sounding like the seal on a tomb. Whatever was about to happen in this room, whatever truths were about to be spoken, They would be spoken in absolute privacy. "Show me." The two words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water. She didn't need to ask what he meant. The blade against her thigh pulsed with sudden heat, responding to his proximity with the same recognition that had been building between them since the moment their eyes first met across a crowded war room. "Your Majesty, show me the blade, Lyra." Her name on his lips carried such certainty that all pretense crumbled away like ash. "Show me the moonblade of House Silvermoon, the weapon that marked you as heir to a throne that everyone believes no longer exists." Her hands shook as she reached beneath her simple servant's dress, unwrapping the layers of cloth that had concealed her heritage for 3 long years. The blade sang as it was revealed, its star-forged silver catching the lamplight and throwing patterns of light and shadow across the chamber walls. Ancient runes carved into the metal seemed to writhe and dance in the flickering glow, spelling out words in a language that predated the current kingdom by centuries. The Alpha King sucked in a sharp breath, his wolf pressing forward behind his human facade with recognition that went deeper than logic. The Blade of Queens. I thought it was destroyed with the fall of the Moonstone dynasty. Everyone thought that. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried clearly in the sudden stillness of the chamber. My grandmother told me she pulled it from the burning palace the night Queen Seraphina died, the night the Silver Moon line was supposed to have ended forever. Your grandmother. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that wild scent that made her wolf whine with desperate longing. Queen Seraphina's daughter, the one who supposedly died in the fire along with her mother and sisters. Princess Lyanna. She survived long enough to flee into the countryside, long enough to bear a daughter who would carry the bloodline forward in secret. The truth tasted strange on her tongue, words she had never spoken aloud finally given voice in the presence of the one person who might understand their weight. She died when I was 5, but not before she made sure I knew what I was, what I carried, what I could never let the world discover. A queen without a kingdom, an heir without a throne. His fingers brushed against the blade's surface, and magic flared between them like golden fire, the ancient weapon recognizing the touch of its destined partner. The prophecy spoke of this, of the time when the Moonstone line would return to stand beside the Alpha Kings as they did in the ancient days. Prophecy. The word came out sharper than she had intended, driven by years of careful skepticism about destiny and fate and all the other concepts that implied her choices didn't matter. The one carved into the throne room walls, written in the old tongue by the first Alpha King and the first Moonstone Queen when they bound their lines together in marriage and magic. His eyes never left her face as he spoke, cataloguing every reaction, every tell that might reveal how much she knew about the heritage she carried. 2 souls, 1 crown, united by moon and storm until the kingdom knows peace eternal. The words sent shivers down her spine, because they felt familiar in a way that defied explanation, as if she had heard them whispered in dreams, spoken by voices that belonged to women who looked like her and carried the same blade that now sang with approval in the space between them. "That's just legend," she said, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Is it?" He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't move, couldn't move, his fingers traced the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her chest tighten with emotion. "Then explain why my wolf recognizes you as both mate and queen. Explain why touching you feels like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Explain why every instinct I possess is telling me that you are exactly what this kingdom has been missing for 25 years. The mate bond flared between them at the contact, golden threads visible in the lamplight, weaving around them with a strength that made political obligations seem fragile and temporary by comparison. She could feel his certainty through the connection, could sense the way his wolf had claimed her completely, despite every logical reason to maintain distance. "The engagement," she said, but the words came out breathless, distracted by the way his thumb brushed across her cheek. "Lady Vivian, the alliance can go to hell." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. "I spent the entire day listening to her family make demands about our wedding, about the concessions they expect in exchange for their political support, about all the ways they plan to use their connection to the crown to advance their own agenda. They'll declare war if you reject her. Let them." His other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly, as if she were something precious that might slip away if he wasn't careful. "I would rather fight 100 wars than spend another day pretending I don't know what you are, pretending I don't feel what I feel when I look at you." "What I am is dangerous," she whispered, but she was leaning into his touch despite her words, drawn to him by forces that went deeper than choice or logic. "What I am could get us both killed. What you are is mine." The words came out rough with possession and something deeper, something that made her wolf throw back its head and howl with joy. "You are my mate, my queen, my other half. You are the missing piece of a puzzle that has been incomplete for 25 years. The kiss, when it came, was fierce and claiming and desperate all at once. His lips crashed against hers with the weight of suppressed longing and political impossibility, and the terrible certainty that this might be the only moment they would ever have. Magic flared between them, bright as starlight and twice as powerful, the blade singing with approval as ancient power recognized its rightful place in the world. The mate bond completed with a snap that she felt in her bones, golden light flooding the chamber as two souls that had been searching for each other across lifetimes finally clicked into place. She could feel his thoughts through the connection, could sense his wonder and his fury and his absolute determination to claim what was his regardless of the consequences. When they broke apart, gasping for air that tasted of magic and promises that couldn't be kept, his eyes held the kind of certainty that moved mountains and toppled kingdoms. "I'm going to break the engagement," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "Tomorrow, in front of the entire court, I'm going to announce that I have found my true mate and that political necessity will no longer dictate the choices of my heart." "Demon." His name slipped out before she could stop it, intimate and familiar in a way that should have terrified her. "Say it again." His request was soft, almost vulnerable, and she realized that no one had probably spoken his name like that in years, not as a king or an alpha or a political symbol, but as a man who needed to be seen and known and chosen for himself. Demon. The name felt right on her tongue, felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. What about the kingdom? What about the war that's coming, the alliances you need to secure? The kingdom will endure, the alliances will be rebuilt, the war will be fought and won. His hands moved to her shoulders, pulling her closer until she could feel his heartbeat against her chest. "But I will not spend another day pretending that duty matters more than the bond that makes me whole. And if they refuse to accept me, if they see a servant with delusions of grandeur instead of a queen with a legitimate claim, then they'll learn to see differently." His smile was sharp as winter frost, carrying the promise of violence for anyone who dared threaten what was his. "The blade chooses its bearer, and it has chosen you. The mate bond completes between equals, and it has completed between us. Anyone who questions your right to stand beside me will have to answer to both of those truths." She wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this decision could destroy them both. But looking into his storm-grey eyes, feeling the absolute certainty that flowed through the mate bond like golden fire, she found that her protests died unspoken. He had chosen her, had looked into the face of political disaster and kingdom-threatening consequences and decided that she was worth the risk, had claimed her as his mate and his queen with a certainty that brooked no argument. "Tomorrow changes everything," she said, and it wasn't a protest any more. It was recognition. "Tomorrow we reclaim what was stolen 25 years ago," he agreed, his voice carrying the promise of revolution. "Tomorrow the Moonstone Line returns to its rightful place beside the Alpha Kings. And if we're wrong, if the prophecy is nothing more than wishful thinking and ancient poetry, then we'll face whatever comes together." His lips brushed against her forehead, a gentle benediction that sealed their fate. Mate to mate, queen to king, as it was always meant to be. The blade pulsed once against her thigh, its ancient magic singing with approval as destiny finally began to unfold the way it had always been written. Tomorrow would bring challenges and threats and possibly war itself. But tonight, in the privacy of his chambers, with the mate bond burning like golden fire between them, they were exactly what they were meant to be, complete. The war horns sounded at dawn, their deep, mournful call echoing across the castle grounds, like the voices of ancient gods announcing the end of the world. Lyra woke to the sound of running feet and shouted orders, to the metallic clash of weapons being drawn and armour being donned in desperate haste. The enemy had come sooner than anyone expected. She was out of bed and dressed before the echoes of the horns faded, her hands steady as she bound the moon blade against her thigh with practised efficiency. But today felt different. Today the ancient weapon seemed to hum with anticipation rather than concealment, as if it knew that the time for hiding was finally over. The corridors of the castle were chaos. Servants ran in every direction, carrying messages and supplies, their faces pale with terror at the sight of enemy banners cresting the hills beyond the walls. Guards shouted orders that no one seemed to hear, their voices lost in the cacophony of a kingdom scrambling to defend itself. But through it all, Lyra felt a strange calm settling over her shoulders like armour she had never known she possessed. The blade against her thigh pulsed with warmth, and with each pulse came something else. Knowledge, strategy, the kind of tactical brilliance that should have taken years to develop, but felt as natural as breathing. She knew exactly where the enemy would strike first, knew which gates would fall and which walls would hold, knew the flow of battle like it was written in her blood, passed down through generations of queens who had stood beside their kings in times of war. The great hall had been transformed into a command centre, its tables covered with maps and its air thick with the tension of men preparing to fight for their lives. The Alpha King stood at the centre of it all, his presence commanding absolute attention as he issued orders with the calm certainty of someone who had been born for moments like this. When his storm-grey eyes found her across the crowded hall, she saw recognition flicker there, followed by something that might have been relief. He gestured for her to approach, and the assembled generals parted to let her pass without question, as if her right to be there was beyond dispute. "The enemy is moving faster than we anticipated," he said when she reached his side, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Their advance scouts crossed the river before midnight. They'll be at our gates within the hour." "They're not coming for the gates." The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "They'll hit the eastern wall where the old watchtower creates a blind spot. 3 waves, the first to draw our attention, the second to breach the wall, the third to pour through the gap before we can reposition our forces." Every man in the hall turned to stare at her, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock and suspicion. A servant girl, predicting enemy tactics with the confidence of a seasoned military strategist, was beyond their comprehension. "How could you possibly know that?" General Morrison demanded, his weathered face creased with scepticism. The blade against her thigh flared with sudden heat, and with it came a flood of ancestral memory. Queen Seraphina standing in this same hall, pointing to maps with tactical precision that had saved the kingdom from invasion. Queen Celeste before her, and Queen Luna before that, generation after generation of warrior queens who had fought beside their kings, with supernatural insight and unwavering courage. "Because I've seen this pattern before," she said, and it was true in ways that defied rational explanation. The Eastern approach has always been their preferred route when they want to avoid our main defences. Lyra is right. The Alpha King's voice cut through the murmurs of disbelief, carrying absolute authority. "I've been studying their movements all morning. The Eastern Wall is exactly where they'll strike." She felt his certainty through the mate bond, felt the way his wolf trusted her completely, despite the impossibility of what she was suggesting. He believed her not because the strategy made tactical sense, though it did, but because the bond between them whispered that she was exactly what she appeared to be, his equal in all things, including war. "But how do we stop them?" General Morrison asked, his scepticism giving way to practical concern. "If they breach the Eastern Wall, they'll be inside our defences before we can mount an effective response." "We don't stop them," Lyra said, her voice growing stronger as certainty settled into her bones. "We let them breach the wall, then crush them in the courtyard where they can't retreat." The strategy poured out of her like water breaking through a dam, complete and fully formed, as if it had been waiting in her blood for exactly this moment. She moved to the maps, her fingers tracing positions and movements with the confidence of someone who had fought this battle 100 times in dreams and ancestral memory. "Here," she said, pointing to the narrow courtyard beyond the Eastern Wall. "We pull our main forces back from the wall itself and position them here, in the shadows of the inner buildings. When the enemy breaks through, they'll think they've won a decisive victory. They'll pour into the courtyard in celebration, never realizing they've walked into a trap. And then?" The Alpha King's voice was carefully neutral, but she could feel his growing excitement through the mate bond, could sense the way the strategy resonated with his own tactical instincts. "Then we close the trap from 3 sides. Archers from the upper windows, cavalry from the north gate, infantry from the south corridor. They'll be caught in a kill box with nowhere to run." The silence that followed was heavy with consideration and dawning respect. These were men who had spent their lives studying warfare, and even they could see the brutal elegance of what she was proposing. It was risky, audacious, and absolutely brilliant. "It could work," General Morrison said slowly, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "It's dangerous as hell, but it could work." "It will work," Lyra's certainty rang through the hall like a bell. "But only if we move quickly. The first wave will hit the wall in less than an hour." What followed was controlled chaos as the most powerful military minds in the kingdom scrambled to implement a strategy conceived by a servant girl with no formal training but an instinct for war that defied explanation. Orders were shouted, troops repositioned, weapons distributed to every able-bodied person in the castle. And through it all, Lyra moved with purpose and authority that no one questioned, as if her right to command in times of crisis was written in the ancient stones of the castle itself. The blade against her thigh sang with approval as she directed the placement of archers, suggested modifications to the trap that would maximize casualties, and coordinated with cavalry commanders she had never met but understood instinctively. "You know," the Alpha King said during a brief lull in the preparations, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "watching you take command like this is possibly the most arousing thing I've ever experienced." Despite everything, despite the approaching battle and the lives hanging in the balance, she felt heat bloom across her cheeks at the raw admiration in his voice. Through the mate bond, she could sense his wonder at discovering this side of her, his pride in having a mate who could stand beside him as an equal in all things. "Save that energy for after we win," she said, but her voice was breathless with something that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of preparation and everything to do with the way he looked at her like she was exactly what he had been waiting for his entire life. The horns sounded again, different this time. The enemy was at the walls. Through the tall windows she could see the dark mass of their forces spreading across the fields like a plague, banners snapping in the wind as they advanced with the confidence of an army that had never known defeat. "Time to go," the Alpha King said, his hand finding hers in a brief moment of connection that sent warmth racing through the mate bond. "Ready to show them what happens when they threaten what's ours?" She squeezed his fingers, feeling the moonblade pulse against her thigh with anticipation. "More than ready." As they moved toward the battlements where their forces waited in carefully orchestrated positions, Lyra felt the last vestiges of her old identity falling away like a discarded cloak. She was no longer the invisible servant who cleaned stalls and hauled water. She was no longer the hidden heir who lived in terror of discovery. She was exactly what the prophecy had promised, what the mate bond had recognized, what the blade had been waiting for her to become. She was the Moonstone Queen, and today she would prove that some bloodlines were forged in fire and tempered by war. Today she would reclaim her birthright one enemy at a time.